So, Alex, tell us a little bit about your research on Liberty Jail.
Well, I've just enjoyed over the course of my career here at BYU studying the Missouri period. Well, my interest in Missouri Latter-day Saint history really began with my doctoral dissertation long time ago. And I've really enjoyed researching the Missouri period. And in regards to Liberty Jail, there's nothing more iconic. I mean, everyone in the church, I mean, virtually everyone has probably heard about Liberty Jail. Mm-hmm. And I think nowadays we have so much more information that's come to light through the Joseph Smith papers, other kinds of research, that we know a lot more about the Liberty Jail experience of these of the church leaders.
So what are some common misconceptions about Liberty Jail, some common misunderstandings about the way the jail was structured and worked and everything like that?
Well, fortunately, we have a real rare photograph taken about in the 1870s, 1878, by a local Liberty daguerreotypist, photographer, and he took a wonderful picture of that. And from that, we can discern a lot of things just by looking at it. Also, we've had some wonderful early history done by a man by the name of Andrew Jensen, who is he's working for the historian's office, and he went on a fact-finding mission with a man by the name of Joseph S. Black, Joseph Smith Black, named after the prophet, and also Edward Stevenson. And in 1888, he goes back there with these two other companions, and they meet some people who actually were part of the jail experience. One being a man by the name of James Ford, who was one of the deputy sheriffs and jailers who actually guarded Joseph Smith. And so from some of this kind of information early on, we can piece together a few more things. So there's a lot more we can still learn, but I think we've learned a lot in just more recent years.
So we visited the jail and saw the visitor center. It's beautiful, but we're trying to create a 3D model to help people understand what the jail would have looked like when Joseph Smith was there. So what are some things that we need to include to make this as accurate as possible?
Well, that's a good thing you're doing. I think that'll be kind of exciting. I think first of all, we have to look at the overall size. And again, we have to thank Andrew Jensen. And again, I don't think he had a tape measure, but he was a pretty good historian and very accurate. And during this visit, he wrote down that it was the outer portion of the jail that was remaining in 1888 was about 22 feet by 22 and a half feet. So roughly 22 feet square. And then he was able to, the party was able to get into the jail itself. Now by this time it was pretty rotten, rotted out a little bit.
The roof had collapsed.
The roof partially collapsed, part of the walls and so on. But from his observation, and I think his pretty good eyeball measurement, he may have had a measuring tape, I'm not sure, but he said that the walls were actually 4 feet thick. So 2 feet of what we would say mortared limestone, and then right with that was a foot of loose rock that was held in by a foot of timber or pylons. I don't know how to describe them. So basically a structure that was 22 by 22 and a half feet, but take off 4 feet around the walls, and it's basically a 14 and a half by 14 interior. He also tried to measure the height, and he said the upper story was about 7 feet, and the lower story was about 6.5 feet. I think that's important because, so one of the prisoners was a man by the name of Alexander McCrae. And Alexander McCrae was a big man, according to his family and those who knew him. Some say he was about 6'4" to 6'6". And there's this kind of folklore, I don't know if you want to say it that way, where they say that they couldn't stand up in the jail. Well, if Andrew Jensen's measurements are correct, and I think they are, 7 feet on the top and 6.5 feet on the bottom, he could probably stand up. In fact, in all of their remembrances or reminiscences or documents they created, no one ever said they couldn't stand up. And so I think that's kind of a misconception, a myth, if you will, that the prisoners couldn't stand up. Well, they certainly could upstairs. Might have been a little tight downstairs. But I think it's important to say that they could stand up, and no one ever mentioned, none of them ever mentioned of the 6 prisoners that were in there that they couldn't stand up. So I think that's something we can probably put to rest there.
I guess to say that they couldn't stand up doesn't mean the jail wasn't a really horrible place to be, though.
Yeah.
For instance, I read one account where a person talked about how their eyes really struggled with the darkness in the jail, that it hurt their eyes quite a bit.
I think that's a good point to make. They certainly had sight problems. You can imagine that there was at the top, in the top story was a window, an open window, if we want to call it that. About, if we look at the Hicks photograph, it's about 1.5 foot square. And down below, the very lower chamber, there's another open window, and this is probably only about 1 foot or so by 6 inches. It's not very big, maybe 1.5 feet. And you can imagine with 4-foot walls, you can't get much sunlight in there. I mean, it's going to be dark. It's almost like an enclosed room. And so for being in a room with, limited light and almost complete darkness, of course they probably had some kerosene lamps and, candles and so on. But to have your eyes in that condition, in a daylight setting, they're going to get pretty sore once you come out and see the light. You know what I'm saying? So when they had a chance to come out of the jail on occasions, it would have been a difficult time to adjust that lighting from being so dark all the time.
Not only that, these windows are open, right? And they're there in the winter months. So was it cold in the jail?
No question. And again, in the summer, it would probably be pretty nice. I mean, you kind of got an insulated area there. But yeah, it's definitely cold. And of course, they begin their incarceration on December 1st. I mean, it's starting to get cold. It's cold in November and October. And of course, it carried on all the way through April 6th, interesting date, in which they were finally released to have their final hearing up in Gallatin. So all total, they're there for 127 days. And it's going to be a cold winter. Anybody who knows Missouri, the wind blows and it's cold. And it's damp in there. And they just got a lot of problems with the cold and the darkness.
Now, where were they in the jail? There's 2 floors. Are they in the bottom floor or the upper floor?
Well, again, we have to thank Andrew Jensen, and there's some other evidence which I'm going to try to explain. But Andrew Jensen, in meeting with James Ford, one of the deputy jailers, the jailer said they spent their daytime hours upstairs. And that only makes sense. They have visitors coming all the time, beginning with their incarceration in December, really all the way through middle of February. We have visitors coming all the time from far west, church leaders, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, all sorts of messengers to bring letters and messages and so on. And so we have them coming, and they would come to the upper floor. They're not going to have them downstairs. So that's where they would eat their meals and basically be there during the daytime. But at night, they would have been in the dungeon. And I think there's this misconception in the church. You go back to Liberty and you look at that model that you've seen and looked at, you think they're in the basement the whole time, or the dungeon cell. But they only did that at night. And so that's why they say, Joseph Smith says that they were cold. They're always cold. They even tried to start some fires down there, but those windows are so small, and there's no flue. Where would the smoke go? And but they were very cold at night. There's just no question. But during the day, they would have been upstairs. And it's interesting. I found a document in the Clay County Historical Society that says they were getting a replacement stove for the jail. in 1841. The jail was built in 1833, so that stove is worn out, and they're getting another stove. So I think there's been this misconception that there was no heat upstairs, but there was.
They might have had a little heat.
Upstairs, no question. But in the evening, when they go down and they go through a trap door and were placed in the basement or the dungeon cell, that's when it's cold. And they're just straw mattresses, and they just have to stay as warm as they can.
So we want to get the outside accurate too. What are some details about the outside that we don't want to overlook?
Well, I think it's interesting too, if we look at the jail that was in Richmond, where they also have Mormon prisoners, and the jail in Columbia, where Parley Pratt and the other, Luman Gibbs and the others were taken. These are relatively new jails, but the one in Columbia had an apartment. The jailer's home was attached to the jail. And clearly in the Liberty Jail, there's no jailer apartment. It's just a singular building. And that would give strong implication to the fact that there had to have been a guardhouse nearby. Because Joseph said, we were kept under guard night and day. Well, where do you put the guards? They're not sleeping in the jail with the prisoners. They're locking them up every night. So there had to be some sort of structure very nearby, probably small, where there was a guardhouse where people would come and check in with the guard so they could go into the facility, into the jail itself. Credentials, or make sure they didn't have tools or weapons or anything. So there had to have been some sort of a structure for a guardhouse to kind of screen the visitors to the prisoners.
Now, one of the sources you said there were iron bars in the wood.
Yeah, we have to thank again Andrew Jensen. He's just the most terrific historian at the time, I think. But he mentions in there that in the upper story windows, there were 5 bars that were perpendicular. And then he specifically says they were embedded in the timber. So it looks like these 5 perpendicular bars were on the very inside of those of the structure, not on the outside in the stone. You can imagine trying to dig holes to put, to carve holes to put in those iron bars. Much easier to put it in the timbers themselves. And downstairs, it looks like there was one horizontal bar, and that's a much smaller window. And so it would not have necessarily been placed perpendicular in the window. So the upper story windows would be very hard to get to look into, or to do anything from the outside. But those 2 lower windows on the north and the south are just barely above ground, because a portion of the jail was underground. And I believe there's a case of a woman by the name of Kingsley, Latter-day Saint, who's living in Liberty, did not join the church up in the main body of the church in Caldwell. And she would push pies, probably at night, just push pies through that small lower window. And of course you could see if they could just push that maybe with a stick and stick it right through there, and then it could slide under that horizontal bar, and they could have a nice pastry there. So again, we have to thank Andrew Jensen. I think he gave a pretty good, accurate description of the jail. I think another important thing is that door. Actually, there were 2 doors. There was an exterior door and an interior door. And you know this as well as anyone, Casey. Yeah. You actually measured that. That outside door is in the...
it's in the Community of Christ Temple.
Exactly.
Down in Independence, yeah.
And it's almost not quite 5.5 feet by 2.5 feet. But there was an interior door as well. So they had the one on the outside, the one on the inside timber. So there was actually a double door entry.
Tell us about Mormon beef and the whole saga surrounding that.
Well, when the Saints finally get to Quincy and then up to Commerce, they're filling out affidavits describing their persecutions and the things. And terrific historical record. Well, in 1841, they're still doing it. And Lyman White mentions in his affidavit that he was fed human flesh. And Hiram Smith mentions that in his affidavit as well. And I think what they thought was human flesh was probably not. There's the statement about how they were fed Mormon beef. Mm-hmm. Well, I think they may have interpreted that to mean that this was a Mormon who was killed and they fed them that human flesh. But it's probably more, when the guards would joke about this, or the statement comes out about Mormon beef, it was probably actually referring to beef that was confiscated by the Missourians, and of course they took a lot of the animals and a lot of the property and personal property and so on of the Latter-day Saints. So I think they just probably misunderstood that. But at the same time, there was this folklore, I guess you might say, that was in the McCrae family, that they were fed human flesh. And in fact, in 1886, February 28, 1886, in the Deseret Evening News, there's this mention made that the Mormons in Missouri, or the prisoners in the Liberty Jail, were fed human flesh. That story got reproduced in the Liberty Tribune in Liberty, Missouri. And William Wood, one of the attorneys in Liberty, who actually is one of the first attorneys for the Latter-day Saints, Edward Partridge and W.W. Phelps hired him and 3 other attorneys, Donovan, Atchison, and a guy by the name of Amos Rees. He was in Liberty, and he said, that did not happen. It is not true. And they were not poisoned. Whatever sickness they had was probably viral or bacterial, I don't know. But he said that did not happen. And I know the jailer, and I know the other jailers, and it didn't happen. In fact, he says all bosh. Now, William Wood was an honorable man, but at the same time, we have to remember the Mormon prisoners had attorneys. And Alexander Donovan and a man by the name of Peter Hardeman Burnett became the first governor of the state of California. Very capable attorneys. That would not have, they would not have allowed for that. That was just unheard of. So I think there's just a little bit of folklore that kind of emerged from some of those statements. That's probably not true. Now, were they treated well? Well, it's not the Marriott, let me tell you. But I think they were taken care of. They were somewhat, the meals weren't great, but they were not abused in that manner. So I think we have to kind of hopefully dispel that myth. Now, again, it's a terrible time. Food was coarse, Joseph Smith said. Rather mundane, probably the same thing every day. But, and again, fortunately, others were able to bring food and other kinds of things to them. But I think it's important on that stove that Joseph Smith's own words were, we had not the privilege of cooking for ourselves. Well, you take that the way he's saying it. If he didn't have the privilege, that means they took away the privilege. Why did they take away the privilege? Well, they didn't want them to have utensils and things that would could possibly be used for an escape. So they were denied that. Plus, there's not just one prisoner or two, there's 6. That would be a very cumbersome trying to have them do their own meals. But that also gives us evidence there was a stove there, and that they would have, had they been given the privilege to cook, of course that stove would be the stove they would have cooked on. So there's another little evidence of that. And over in the Richmond jail, where these other prisoners were kept at the same time, they said that there was a stove on the first floor, which kept them warm. So there's no question there was a stove of some sort. Now, whether they could actually cook on it, that kind of thing, not sure, but the fact that Joseph Smith said we had not the privilege, they wouldn't let us, implies that there was a stove and they would hope to cook their own meals, but that was not, that was denied them.
There's some stories about Joseph Smith's dog in the jail. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there's not a lot of evidence, but there is one little snippet that suggests that Joseph Smith's dog may have been in the jail with him for a short period of time. This comes from a man by the name of Aaron Harlan. He lived over in Iowa, Keokuk area, And he visited Joseph Smith frequently. He'd come across and go visit with the prophet. And on one occasion, he's visiting with him, and there's his dog, and his dog's name was Old Major. And he said, "Your dog is very fat." And he says, "Well, he eats as I do, the victuals from the table." And he says, "This dog cannot be separated from me. He was with me in Missouri's jails." Now, Joseph Smith was imprisoned for a short time in Independence. I don't think Old Major was there. It was only about 4 days. Then he was about another 3 weeks in Richmond. But in Liberty, he was there for over 4 months. And if the prisoners were allowed to have visitors, and there were many, as I've mentioned, in fact, I've got over 70 by name, perhaps Emma brought down the dog and said, "Here's your watchdog." Now, this dog was a big dog. It was an English Mastiff. That is a huge dog. And they're fiercely loyal. And I just can think Joseph Smith was so happy to have his dog. What's interesting in one of his last letters to Emma over in Quincy, he's about ready to get out. He asks how the family's doing, and then he says, "How's Old Major?" So I think when Emma finally left northern Missouri, left far west in mid-February, that she took Old Major with him, and he's missing him. So there's a possibility that Old Major, that huge dog, that loyal dog of his, was in Liberty Jail for at least a time.